"You're not on the deed, so you don't belong here," my uncle said, taking my plate at the family dinner. Cousins watched silently as he cleared my seat. Then, a court envelope arrived. "My name is Rachel Bennett. I'm 38 years old. I work as a paralegal at a small legal aid office, helping people navigate systems that weren't designed to be fair. I grew up in the house that's now being fought over, the same house where I cared for my grandmother during the final 2 years of her illness. My family has always viewed me as temporary, despite the years I spent caregiving and paying the utilities when nobody else would. I live modestly in a small apartment when I'm not at the house, and I avoid conflict whenever possible. I've always been labeled too quiet to challenge authority or speak up when decisions get made without me. After my grandmother died, my uncle appointed himself the family decision-maker. He made announcements, he organized gatherings, he spoke for everyone. Meanwhile, I was the one who had handled her medical appointments, her insurance calls, and her household bills completely alone. I wasn't rich or glamorous. I never demanded recognition or fought for attention at family events. My relatives valued louder personalities and obvious financial success over service and reliability. I believed that keeping the peace would preserve family bonds, even when I kept getting pushed to the sidelines. But I had something they didn't expect. I had copies of legal documents, payment records, and written statements from my grandmother. Years of paralegal work had taught me the power of documentation and the importance of timing. If you've ever been dismissed despite carrying the responsibility no one else wanted, subscribe. Share your story in the comments if family treated you like you didn't belong in a place you built. Click hype if you believe quiet strength deserves recognition too. The family dinner was held at the house to discuss its future, though I wasn't told that was the purpose when I arrived. The dining room felt smaller than usual, crowded with relatives I rarely saw outside holidays. The smell of roasted chicken filled the air, but nobody was eating yet. My uncle stood at the head of the table and announced I had no legal standing and would need to vacate the property within 30 days. He distributed printed notices, passing them around like meeting agendas. Each one claimed the house belonged solely to him through inheritance laws. My cousin Brenda got up from her chair, walked to my place setting, and removed my plate and silverware without saying a word. She set them on the counter behind her. The message was clear. My uncle looked directly at me and said loudly enough for everyone to hear, "You were just helping out. That doesn't make you an owner." I tried to explain that I had paid the utilities and the property taxes during my grandmother's illness, that I had documentation of every payment. The room went quiet for a moment. Then my aunt waved her hand dismissively. "That was basically rent, or just duty. You were living there." Another relative nodded. "You can't expect to stay forever just because you helped." A neighbor who'd been invited to the dinner stood in the doorway to the kitchen, watching the whole exchange. I could see her expression, uncomfortable but curious. The public nature of the moment made my face burn. Before I could respond further, my uncle handed me a typed eviction notice, right there in front of everyone, like I was a stranger. I took it with shaking hands and left without finishing the conversation. 3 days later, an envelope arrived at my apartment. Inside was a legal notice of property transfer. My uncle had filed paperwork with the county claiming ownership. The document listed me as a non-resident, which directly contradicted the years of documented occupancy I had maintained. The betrayals came quickly after that dinner. The first happened while I was at work on a Tuesday afternoon. I came home to find the locks on the house had been changed. My belongings were packed into cardboard boxes and stacked on the front porch. Some of the boxes were taped shut, others were open, exposing my clothes and books to anyone passing by. My uncle's truck was parked in the driveway, but he didn't come outside when I arrived. I knocked on the door. No answer. I called his phone. He texted back, "This is for everyone's comfort. Please collect your things." No apology, no explanation beyond that single sentence. I stood there on the porch, my neighbors watching from across the street, and loaded boxes into my car in 3 trips. The second betrayal came through social media. My cousin posted a long message about protecting family assets from people who take advantage of grief and generosity. She never used my name, but she tagged other relatives and used phrases like outsiders pretending to belong and protecting what's ours. The post got dozens of likes and comments. People I'd known my whole life responded with supportive messages, agreeing that families need to stand together against manipulation. I saw it at work when a coworker showed me her phone, asking quietly if I was okay. The humiliation was public, spread across a platform where I couldn't respond without looking defensive. The third betrayal was the most calculated. My uncle filed additional paperwork with the county claiming I had never actually lived in the house, that I had only visited to provide occasional care. Utility accounts were quietly transferred into his name with backdated effective dates, making it look like he'd been responsible for them all along. I later discovered he had pressured two of my cousins to sign written statements supporting his version of events, statements that claimed I'd only stayed at the house sporadically. But I didn't collapse under the weight of it. I started gathering evidence instead. I pulled receipts from my files, printed bank statements showing automatic payments for water, gas, and electricity. I requested certified copies of property tax payments directly from the county assessor's office. I compiled my caregiver logs, the detailed notes I'd kept for insurance and medical purposes showing continuous presence. I got residency records from the city, documents proving my address had been listed as that house for over 2 years. I stayed silent publicly, refused to argue in family group chats or respond to the posts. I just built a timeline, piece by piece, until the facts were undeniable. What they didn't know was that I had copies of every document they thought nobody kept. I'm a paralegal. I've spent 15 years learning that paper trails matter more than promises. I had notarized caregiver agreements signed by my grandmother, official documents we'd prepared together when her illness progressed, and she wanted to make sure I could make medical decisions. I had a recorded voicemail she left me 8 months before she died. In it, her voice was weak but clear. "Rachel, honey, this is your home. You can stay here as long as you need, forever if that's what you want. Don't let anyone tell you different." I'd saved it originally just to hear her voice again, but now it was evidence. My paralegal training had taught me years ago to store duplicate copies of important documents off-site. I kept a fireproof box at my office with backups of everything. Property tax payments could be traced directly from my personal bank account to the county, each one stamped with a confirmation number and a date. I had photographs with metadata showing I'd been living in that house continuously, timestamps on pictures of holidays and ordinary days that proved occupancy. I wasn't just upset. I had a plan they never saw coming. I filed a quiet petition with the probate court to challenge the property transfer on the grounds of equitable interest and fraudulent filing. A court date was scheduled, and I received the notice by certified mail. My uncle and the rest of the family had no idea I'd initiated legal action. They assumed I'd taken my boxes and disappeared quietly, the way people do when they're embarrassed and defeated. They thought silence meant surrender. They were wrong. The ally who helped me through this was my mentor at the legal aid office, a senior attorney named Margaret Cho. She'd been practicing law for 30 years and had seen every kind of family dispute imaginable. I showed her everything I'd compiled. She sat at her desk reviewing the documents, flipping through pages methodically, and finally looked up at me. "Rachel, you have a strong case for both residency and equitable interest, and your uncle's retroactive filing could be considered fraud." She helped me prepare an emergency injunction to halt the property transfer while the case was being reviewed. We filed it the same week. Meanwhile, my family grew more arrogant by the day. My uncle started talking openly about renovations he wanted to make to the house. He invited a contractor to give estimates, and my cousin posted photos of paint samples and new fixtures. There was a neighborhood gathering 2 weeks before the court date, a casual backyard barbecue, and my uncle spent the evening talking about his plans to sell the property for a significant profit. "Real estate market is hot right now," he said loudly, holding a beer and gesturing with his free hand. Timing couldn't be better. My cousins began visiting the house to measure rooms, discussing which furniture they wanted to keep and which pieces they'd donate. They talked about it in the family group chat, which I'd been removed from, but heard about through a cousin who felt guilty. I documented everything they said publicly. I took screenshots. I noted dates and statements. Margaret advised me to stay completely silent and let them keep talking. "Let them speak first in court," she said. "Overconfidence makes people careless." The tension built as the hearing date approached. My uncle had no idea I had legal representation. None of them did. The courtroom was small and plain, with fluorescent lights overhead and wooden benches that reminded me of church pews. The air smelled faintly of floor cleaner and paper. My uncle arrived with an attorney, a man in an expensive suit who carried a leather briefcase and looked confident. My cousins filled the gallery, sitting in a row like spectators at a performance. The judge entered and we all stood. She was middle-aged with short gray hair and reading glasses perched on her nose. The hearing began with my uncle's attorney presenting his case. He argued that Rachel Bennett had been a temporary guest who provided occasional caregiving but had no legal claim to the property. He described me as someone who had lived primarily elsewhere and only stayed at the house sporadically. He presented the transfer documents and the backdated utility accounts as evidence of my uncle's long-standing responsibility for the property. Then it was my turn. Margaret stood and calmly began presenting documentation. Utility bills in my name dating back 2 full years, property tax payment receipts from my personal bank account, the notarized caregiver agreement showing my legal authority and residency status, certified residency records from the city listing the house as my primary address. Then she played the voicemail. My grandmother's voice filled the courtroom, frail but unmistakable. "Rachel, honey, this is your home. You can stay here as long as you need. Forever, if that's what you want. Don't let anyone tell you different." The room went completely silent. The judge leaned forward slightly, her attention fully focused. Margaret continued, highlighting the retroactive transfer of utility accounts and questioning how my uncle could claim financial responsibility when the payment records showed otherwise. She pointed out inconsistencies in the cousins' written statements, showing timestamps and records that contradicted their claims. My uncle's attorney tried to argue that I had no formal ownership rights, that my grandmother's verbal statements didn't constitute a legal transfer of property. Margaret responded by citing equitable interest and adverse possession laws, explaining that continuous occupancy, financial contribution, and documented caregiving created a legal claim that couldn't simply be dismissed. The judge asked my uncle directly about the backdated account transfers. He stammered, claimed it was an administrative correction. She looked unimpressed. She reviewed the documents in front of her for what felt like several minutes. Then she spoke. "Based on the evidence presented, I'm ruling that the property transfer is invalid pending a full investigation into the filing process. There are significant irregularities here that need to be examined." She paused. "Furthermore, I'm issuing an emergency occupancy order granting Ms. Bennett legal right to remain in the property during this investigation." She looked at my uncle over her glasses. "I'm also advising you that if this investigation determines these filings were knowingly false, you could face fraud charges." The courtroom stayed silent. My uncle's face went pale. The power in that room shifted so quickly it felt physical, like air pressure dropping before a storm. My cousins exchanged looks but said nothing. Margaret gathered her documents calmly. I remained seated, waiting to be dismissed, speaking only when the judge addressed me directly to confirm I understood the order. My uncle left the courtroom without making eye contact with anyone. I returned to the house 3 days later, accompanied by a sheriff's deputy as required by the court order. The locks were changed again, this time with my name on the new keys. My belongings were moved back inside from storage, and occupancy was legally restored under my name. My family stopped contacting me almost immediately. The group chats went quiet. Invitations to gatherings stopped coming. An investigation into the falsified documents and backdated accounts was officially opened by the county. My cousins quietly retracted their written statements when questioned by investigators, claiming they'd been pressured and hadn't understood what they were signing. I didn't celebrate or gloat. I just restored the house to the way my grandmother had kept it, slowly and carefully. I continued the legal process calmly, working with Margaret to ensure everything was handled properly. I thought a lot during those weeks about the difference between being present and being acknowledged, between showing up and being seen. I learned that silence, when it's backed by evidence and preparation, isn't weakness, it's strategy. My family had assumed silence meant powerless. They were wrong. The final reflection I kept coming back to was simple. They said I had no rights, but the truth, documented and undeniable, said otherwise. If your family ever tried to push you out of a place where you built your life, you know exactly how isolating that feels. The assumptions, the dismissals, the public humiliation. Share your story below and tell us how you stood your ground when everyone expected you to disappear. Subscribe to join others who refuse to be erased from their own history. Click hype to help this story reach others who desperately need to hear it. Did this story hit home? Let me know by liking the video and sharing your thoughts in the comments. Click hype to help this story find others who felt the same way. Your support makes a huge difference.